My greedy sister wasted her inheritance, then tried to seize mine. Her regret was instant. Growing up, my sister Maddie always acted like she ran the show. She wasn't just the older sister, she was the self-appointed director of our entire family's existence. Now, at 27, she's married to a guy named Jason who's basically just a male echo of her own arrogance. He walks around with a permanent smirk, as if the world is his personal oyster and he's just waiting for the rest of us to shuck it for him. Meanwhile, I'm 17, just trying to survive my last year of high school, and I'm living with my Aunt Susan. It's been this way since Dad passed away, mostly because Maddie was too busy throwing her signature passive-aggressive tantrums to deal with anything as mundane as real life or, her grieving younger brother. The tension between Maddie and Aunt Susan isn't new. It's a legendary feud, a cold war that's been simmering since before I can even remember. To understand it, you have to understand Maddie. She's a control freak in the purest sense of the term. She doesn't just like to be in charge, she needs to be. When we were kids, this need was all-consuming. Game night, Maddie had to pick the game, and it had to be one she was good at. Movie night, we were watching her favorite, even if we all seen it a dozen times. If she didn't get her way, the world would be treated to a performance of the most epic passive-aggressive tantrum you've ever seen. It was a masterclass in manipulation. The sighs, the eye rolls, the sudden deafening silence that made everyone uncomfortable until they caved. And most of the time, it worked. It worked on our parents, it worked on our friends, and it definitely worked on me. There was only one person who was completely immune to Maddie's particular brand of magic: Aunt Susan. Aunt Susan didn't play Maddie's games, and for that, Maddie hated her with a passion that defied all logic. I still have this one memory burned into my brain from when we were younger. Dad was sick with the flu, and Aunt Susan had come over to help manage the house. Maddie, who was probably 15 at the time, was supposed to be doing the dishes, a chore she'd been assigned days ago. Instead, she was leaning against the counter, furiously texting Jason and pretending to be deaf to the world. Aunt Susan, who has this incredible no-nonsense radar, walked in, took one look at the sink full of dirty plates, and then at Maddie. She didn't yell. She just said in this calm, steady voice, "Maddie, get off your phone and finish your chores." Maddie slowly lifted her head, her eyes full of teenage venom, and muttered something under her breath just loud enough for us to hear. "You're not my mom." Aunt Susan didn't even blink. She didn't get angry, she just leaned against the doorframe, crossed her arms, and said, "No, but I'm not your mate either, so get moving." The sheer finality of it was stunning. Maddie's face went through a whole spectrum of emotions: shock, anger, defeat. She finally put her phone down and started doing the dishes, but she slammed every single plate and cup into the drying rack with such force, I was sure she was trying to shatter them into a million pieces. Afterward, she cornered me in my room and ranted for a solid 20 minutes about how Aunt Susan was always on her case, how she was trying to take over, how she had no right to act like she was in charge. I just sat there, nodding silently, because I knew the truth. Aunt Susan was right. Maddie's resentment of Aunt Susan only festered and grew as we got older. It became this toxic living thing. Anytime Dad needed help with something, driving to a doctor's appointment, sorting through bills, making sure there was actual food in the fridge instead of just takeout menus, Aunt Susan was the one who showed up. Maddie, of course, was always too busy. She called it interfering. She'd complain to anyone who would listen that Aunt Susan was trying to control the family, that she was overstepping her boundaries.
I called it stepping up. Maddie didn't want to see it that way, because every time Aunt Susan helped, it just highlighted how much Maddie wasn't doing. By the time Jason entered the picture and became a permanent fixture, Maddie had perfected her golden child act. Jason absolutely worshipped the ground she walked on, and Maddie soaked it up, loving the fact that she finally had someone who was completely convinced she could do no wrong. Aunt Susan, being Aunt Susan, saw right through Jason from the very beginning. She took one look at his smug smile and heard him make one condescending comment, and she had him pegged. "He's arrogant and fake," she told me privately, "and he's a bad influence on her." Spoiler alert, she was 100% correct. But Maddie didn't care. She acted like Jason was the best thing that had ever happened to her, a gift from the universe, and she dismissed anyone who dared to disagree, especially Aunt Susan. This was the foundation upon which our entire family dynamic was built, a fragile, volatile structure of Maddie's ego, just waiting for the right gust of wind to come along and blow it all to pieces. Jason wasn't just arrogant. He was a full-blown, card-carrying jerk. Every single time he graced our house with his presence, he had to make some snarky, backhanded comment. If Dad, bless his heart, spent an hour making a nice dinner, Jason would take one bite and say something like, "Well, this is interesting," with a little smirk that made my blood boil. If I ever mentioned my plans to study pre-med in college, he'd let out this little laugh and say, "Better have a backup plan, kid. Not everyone's cut out for that kind of pressure." The worst part was that Maddie never, ever stood up for me or for Dad. She would just laugh along with him, as if his blatant rudeness was some kind of sophisticated inside joke that the rest of us were just too simple to understand. Aunt Susan, on the other hand, didn't hold back. She had a zero-tolerance policy for Jason's nonsense. She'd either shut him down with a single razor-sharp comment that would leave him sputtering, or she would just straight-up ignore him, acting as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. Both options drove him absolutely nuts. Maddie's relationship with Aunt Susan, already on life support, plummeted after she married Jason. She started showing up to family gatherings less and less, and when she did, it was only to make some dramatic, theatrical exit after picking a fight with Aunt Susan. I remember one Thanksgiving so vividly. We were all trying to have a nice meal, and Maddie, out of nowhere, just started ranting about how some people in the family didn't respect her marriage or her choices. Everyone at the table knew exactly who she was talking about, but no one said a word. Finally, Aunt Susan just shrugged, took a sip of her wine, and said calmly, "Respect is earned, not demanded." That was it. That was all it took. Maddie's face turned crimson. She pushed her chair back with a screech, grabbed Jason's arm, and stormed out of the house, dragging him behind her like a prop. We didn't hear from her for months after that. Not a call, not a text. It was like she had wiped us all from her existence. Despite all this drama, Aunt Susan never stopped being there for me and for Dad. She wasn't just an aunt to me, she was like a second parent, a rock of stability in the chaotic sea that was our family. While Maddie was busy playing house with Jason, Aunt Susan was the one helping me with my calculus homework, the one driving me to early morning swim practice, the one teaching me how to cook something other than mac and cheese. She never made me feel like a burden, even when I was struggling with my grades and the overwhelming sadness of everything going on with Dad. The truth is, Maddie's deep-seated hatred of Aunt Susan was never really about Aunt Susan at all. It was about Maddie. Aunt Susan saw Maddie for exactly who she was, self-centered, manipulative, and not nearly as perfect as she desperately wanted everyone to believe. That terrified Maddie, because she couldn't control Aunt Susan the way she controlled everyone else. She couldn't charm her with a fake smile, she couldn't guilt-trip her with a sob story, and she couldn't twist her words to make herself look like the victim. Instead of facing that uncomfortable truth, Maddie just labeled Aunt Susan as the enemy and built a fortress around her own ego. Looking back now, it's almost impressive how long Maddie held on to that grudge. Even after she got married and moved out, she would still find ways to complain about Aunt Susan to anyone who would listen. "Why does she always have to be so involved?" she'd whine. Or, "I can't stand how she still treats me like I'm a child." All the while, Aunt Susan was the one taking care of everything Maddie couldn't be bothered with, making sure Dad took his medication, keeping the fridge stocked, and holding our fractured family together with sheer force of will. I didn't realize how truly bad things would get between them until after Dad passed away. That's when Maddie's long-simmering hatred curdled into something else, something meaner, darker, and far more destructive. It wasn't just about disliking Aunt Susan anymore. It was about trying to burn her to the ground. And trust me, Maddie was just getting started. By the time Dad's health really started to decline in my junior year, I knew we were heading into a storm. He'd been dealing with heart problems for as long as I could remember, but it had always been manageable. Now it wasn't. He'd get winded just walking from the kitchen to the living room, and some days the pain was so bad he could barely get out of bed. It killed me to see him like that. Dad was always the strong one, the guy who'd work double shifts at the factory and still come home and make pancakes on Sunday mornings. Seeing him frail and weak was like watching the foundation of my world crumble. Aunt Susan stepped in right away, without hesitation. She'd always been there for us, but now it was different. This was full time. She started coming over almost daily, helping with everything from scheduling doctor's appointments to making sure Dad actually ate something other than toast. Maddie, as you might have guessed, was nowhere to be found. I tried, I really did. I'd text her updates, "Dad's not doing great today, you should come by."
I'd call her and leave voicemails. "Hey, it's me. Just wanted to let you know Dad had another doctor's appointment." She always had an excuse. "Jason's been working so much late, I just can't get away." Or, "I've got so much going on at work, it's a crazy time for me." The one that really broke me, the one that made me want to throw my phone against the wall was, "Just let me know if it gets serious." What the hell did she think was happening? Did she think his heart condition was just a hobby? He was seriously ill, and she couldn't even spare an hour to come and sit with him. I'll never forget the night Dad collapsed. It was a Tuesday, and I was in the kitchen at the table, trying to force myself to finish a history paper. The house was quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, I heard a loud, sickening thud from the living room. It was a sound I'll never forget, the sound of a body hitting the hardwood floor. I shot up from my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs, and ran in. There he was, lying on the floor next to his recliner, clutching his chest. His face was pale, slick with sweat, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of pain and terror. I completely froze. For a second, my brain just refused to process what I was seeing. Then pure instinct took over. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. As soon as I hung up with the dispatcher, I called Aunt Susan. She picked up on the first ring. I don't even remember what I said, just a jumble of panicked words. "Dad, floor, can't breathe." She got there before the ambulance did. I heard her car screech into the driveway, and then she was bursting through the front door, her face tight with worry, but her movements calm and purposeful. She took one look at Dad, then at me, and took charge. She knelt beside him, talking to him in a low, soothing voice while we waited for the sirens to get closer. Maddie, of course, didn't pick up. I called her while we were waiting, my voice cracking with fear. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message. "Maddie, Dad's going to the hospital. It's bad. You need to come now." That hospital stay was the beginning of the end. Dad was there for weeks, in and out of the ICU. And every single day, I held on to a sliver of hope that Maddie would show up. She never did. Aunt Susan and I were there every single day, sitting by his bedside, holding his hand and trying to keep his spirits up. The nurses knew us by name. They'd bring us extra coffee and tell us what a strong family we were. I always felt a pang of guilt when they said that, because it wasn't true. It was just me and Aunt Susan. Maddie didn't even bother to call until the second week. And when she did, it wasn't to ask how Dad was doing. It was to complain. She launched into this whole sob story about how hard her life was, how Jason's health was acting up again, and how stressed she was. I just stood there in the hospital corridor, listening to her go on and on, feeling this cold, hard knot of anger tighten in my stomach. Now, here's the thing about Jason. He's got some kind of chronic illness. I don't know the specifics because we've never been close, and frankly, I don't care. But Maddie loved to bring it up whenever it was convenient for her, like a trump card she could play to get out of anything. "You don't understand how hard it is," she'd say, her voice dripping with manufactured suffering. "Jason's been so sick lately, and I have to take care of him." I get it. Being sucks. But she was using it as a shield, an excuse to ignore the fact that her own father was dying in a hospital bed. The day Dad passed away, it was just me and Aunt Susan in the room with him. He'd been in and out of consciousness all day, his breathing shallow and ragged. The doctor had told us it was a matter of hours. I held his hand, his skin cool and papery against mine, and Aunt Susan gently stroked his hair, telling him it was okay, that he could let go, that we would be okay. When he finally took his last breath, it felt like the whole world just stopped. The beeping of the machines flatlined into one long, piercing tone. And the silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. I don't think I've ever cried so hard in my entire life. Aunt Susan stayed with me the whole time, holding me as I completely broke down, her own tears falling silently into my hair. Maddie didn't even know until hours later when I finally got through to her. She acted like I was the one who had done something wrong. "Why didn't you tell me it was this serious?" she said, her voice laced with this fake, syrupy concern that made me want to scream. I had been telling her for weeks. I had been calling and texting and leaving messages. She just didn't care enough to listen. Maddie didn't show up for the funeral either. She sent a text message a few hours before the service saying something about Jason not feeling well and how she couldn't possibly leave him alone. It was the final, most selfish act in a lifetime of selfish acts. Aunt Susan and I handled everything. We arranged the service, we sorted through Dad's belongings, we made sure all the bills were paid. Maddie didn't lift a finger. She sent some flowers and a generic sympathy card with deepest sympathies printed in a fancy font, but that was it. I was so furious I could barely see straight,
but I didn't have the energy to fight her. I was too busy trying to process the fact that my dad, my hero, was gone. A few days after the funeral, when the house was quiet and the casseroles from well-meaning neighbors had stopped arriving, Aunt Susan sat me down at the kitchen table. "Your dad left a will," she said gently. "We'll need to go through it with a lawyer. I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm here for you, and we'll get through this together." I just nodded, not really understanding the weight of her words. At that point, I wasn't even thinking about money or wills. I was just trying to get through each day without the world feeling completely empty. When Maddie finally did show up at the house a week later, she acted like nothing had happened. She waltzed in like it was just another casual Tuesday, completely ignoring the fact that she'd missed her father's final moments and his funeral. She dropped her purse on the counter, looked around, and got straight to the point. "So, what's going on with the will?" she asked, like she was inquiring about the weather. Aunt Susan just gave her a cold, hard look and said, "We'll find out when we meet with the lawyer." It was obvious from the very start that Maddie didn't care about anything except the money. She didn't ask about Dad's belongings, or his old photos, or his watch, or anything sentimental. She just wanted to know how much she was getting. It made me physically sick to my stomach. Aunt Susan, on the other hand, was completely focused on making sure everything was done the way Dad wanted. She knew how much Dad wanted me to go to med school, and she wasn't going to let Maddie's greed get in the way of that. By the time we sat down in the lawyer's office a few days later, I was bracing myself for the worst. Maddie had already made it crystal clear that she didn't think Aunt Susan had any right to be involved in any of this, but Dad's will said otherwise. The lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Carter, explained that Dad's estate would be divided equally. Maddie and I were each getting 50%. But since I wasn't 18 yet, Aunt Susan was named the custodian of my share until my birthday. The look on Maddie's face when she heard that was pure, unadulterated rage. She didn't say anything right then, but I could see the wheels turning in her head, the fury building behind her eyes. After the meeting, Maddie pulled me aside in the hallway. "You know," she said, her voice all sweet and fake, like she was trying to sell me something I didn't want. "Aunt Susan doesn't really understand us, right? She's always been kind of cold, a bit distant. But we're family, and family should stick together. If you ever need help with the inheritance, or if you have any questions, you can just come to me. Don't let her control you." I didn't say anything, but I knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to drive a wedge between me and the one person who had actually been there for me, all because she couldn't stand that Aunt Susan was in control. Aunt Susan wasn't having any of it. Later that day, she sat me down and said, "I know Maddie is going to try to manipulate you. She's going to try to turn you against me. Don't let her. This money is for your future, for med school. Your father trusted me to protect it for you, and I'm not going to let her take that away." I didn't fully grasp the depths of what Aunt Susan meant at the time, but I trusted her more than anyone. And thank God I did, because Maddie was about to turn this whole thing into a complete and utter nightmare. The day we met with the lawyer to officially go over the details of Dad's will was one of the most painfully awkward days of my life. It wasn't just the heavy cloud of sadness that still hung over everything. It was the palpable tension, the knowledge that Maddie was going to turn the whole somber affair into a three-ring circus. She strolled into Mr. Carter's office like she owned the place, dressed in some expensive-looking designer outfit that practically screamed, "Look at me, I'm a successful adult." She didn't even bother to say hello to Aunt Susan, just gave her a brief, dismissive glance before turning her attention to me. "So, what's the deal? How's this all going to work?" she asked, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the lawyer's desk. Mr. Carter was an older gentleman with kind eyes and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He seemed like the type of lawyer who had seen it all, which was a good thing because Maddie wasn't exactly subtle about her intentions. He started by going through some preliminary legal jargon, but Maddie couldn't have cared less. She interrupted him halfway through his sentence. "Can you just skip to the part where we find out what we're getting?" she asked, with a complete lack of shame. Aunt Susan gave her a look that could have frozen lava, but Mr. Carter just nodded patiently and pushed his glasses back up his nose. "Of course," he said, maintaining his professionalism, "your father's estate will be divided equally between the two of you, 50% to each of you. However, since Ethan is still a minor, their share will be managed by Miss Susan as designated in the will, until they turn 18. I swear you could have heard a pin drop in that office. Maddie's smile, which had been plastered on her face, froze solid. For a full second, she just stared at Mr. Carter like she couldn't believe the words that had just come out of his mouth. Then, in the fakest, most saccharine voice possible, she said, "Oh, that makes sense. Of course Aunt Susan would be in charge. She's always so responsible."
I almost had to physically stop myself from laughing out loud. Maddie couldn't have sounded less genuine if she'd tried. Aunt Susan didn't say a word, but I could feel the quiet strength radiating from her. She was ready for whatever nonsense Maddie was about to pull. After the meeting, as we were walking out to the parking lot, Maddie cornered me next to Aunt Susan's car. "Hey, just so you know," she said, leaning in conspiratorially like she was about to share some big, important secret. "You don't have to listen to Aunt Susan about everything. I mean, she's great and all, but we're siblings. We should be making these decisions together, as a family." I just nodded, not wanting to start a screaming match in the middle of a parking lot, but inside I was fuming. Maddie had spent years bad-mouthing Aunt Susan, calling her controlling and overbearing and a busybody, and now she was trying to act like they were best friends who should be co-parenting my inheritance? It was so transparent, it was almost pathetic. Aunt Susan must have seen the look on my face when I got into the passenger seat, because as soon as we pulled out of the parking lot, she asked, "What did she say to you?" "Just the usual," I sighed, staring out the window. "She thinks we should be making decisions together, that you're controlling me." Aunt Susan sighed, her grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "I knew this was coming," she said, her voice low and steady. "Maddie's never been one to let something like this go without a fight. Listen to me, Ethan. Your father trusted me to manage this money for a reason. He wanted you to have a future, to go to med school, to have the life he always dreamed of for you. Don't let her guilt you into giving that up." I nodded again. I knew she was right. Maddie was too stubborn, too entitled to let something like this go. It didn't take long for her to show her true colors. Over the next few weeks, she started showing up at Aunt Susan's house more often than she ever had in her entire life. This was the same Maddie who used to avoid family events like the plague if she knew Aunt Susan was going to be there. And now she was dropping by unannounced, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She'd bring pastries from some fancy bakery or a bouquet of flowers, acting all sweet and charming, but it was so fake it made my skin crawl. "Family is so important," she said one day, sitting primly on the edge of the couch in Aunt Susan's living room, sipping tea like she actually cared about anything other than herself.
"We've all been through so much, and I just think we need to stick together, heal together." Aunt Susan wasn't buying it for a second. She just sat there, watching her over the rim of her own teacup. "What do you need, Maddie?" she asked bluntly, cutting right through the performance. Maddie blanked, her fake smile slipping for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Nothing. I just wanted to check in, see how you two are doing. Is that so wrong?" Aunt Susan didn't respond, and the silence in the room grew thick and uncomfortable. Eventually, Maddie stopped pretending and got straight to the point. One afternoon, she showed up at Aunt Susan's door with tears in her eyes and a sob story so dramatic it should have won an award. Apparently, Jason's chronic illness had taken a turn for the worse, and he needed surgery. Expensive surgery. The kind of surgery their insurance wouldn't fully cover. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death," Maddie said, dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. "But we're desperate. Jason's been so sick, and the doctors say this is his only chance. I don't know what else to do." She turned to me, her eyes wide and pleading, putting on a masterclass in victimhood. "Please, Ethan, just a small portion of your inheritance. It would mean everything to us. We're family." I just sat there, frozen. I didn't know what to say. On the one hand, Jason's health was serious, supposedly. On the other hand, this was my inheritance. This was my future. This was the money Dad had worked his whole life to leave for me. The money that was supposed to get me to med school. Giving it to Maddie would mean throwing all of that away. Before I could even form a thought, Aunt Susan stepped in. "That money is for Ethan, Maddie," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "It's not for you, and it's not for Jason. Your father made that very clear in his will." Maddie's face twisted, the fake sweetness disappearing in an instant and replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. "You've always hated me," she snapped, her voice rising to a shriek. "You've been against me since we were kids. This isn't about Dad's wishes. This is about you trying to control everything like you always do." Aunt Susan didn't even flinch. "Believe whatever you want, Maddie," she said calmly, "but that money isn't going anywhere." With that, Maddie stormed out, slamming the door so hard the pictures on the wall rattled. I thought that would be the end of it, that she'd finally gotten the message. But I should have known better. Maddie wasn't done, not by a long shot. I thought Maddie storming out of Aunt Susan's house, slamming the door, and peeling out of the driveway would be the last I'd hear from her for a while.
I was wrong. Maddie doesn't give up easily, especially when she thinks she's been wronged or denied something she believes she's entitled to. The thing about Maddie is, she can't stand not being in control. It eats away at her like a cancer. And when she doesn't get her way, she doesn't just get over it. She goes all in, turning up the drama to maximum volume and escalating the situation until she gets what she wants, or until everything burns down around her. What I didn't expect was how far she would be willing to take things. It started small, like it always does with Maddie. She sent me a couple of texts the day after she left Aunt Susan's, trying to act all calm and reasonable. "Hey, I know things got heated yesterday," she wrote. "I just want you to think about what I said. Jason's surgery isn't optional. It's life or death. We're family, and I know Dad would want you to help." I ignored it at first. I didn't want to engage because I knew it wouldn't lead anywhere good. It would just be another opportunity for her to twist my words and try to manipulate me.
But Maddie doesn't take silence as an answer. She sees it as an invitation to try harder. The next day, she showed up at Aunt Susan's house again, completely unannounced. I was in my room trying to study for a physics test when I heard the doorbell ring, followed by Maddie's overly loud, overly sweet voice drifting up from the entryway. "I want to talk to Ethan," she said, trying to sound innocent. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it from the porch," Aunt Susan's voice replied, cool and distant. I peeked through my window and saw Maddie standing on the front porch, holding a manila folder like she was about to make some big corporate presentation. "Fine," she huffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder in a gesture of pure indignation. "I brought some information about Jason's condition. I thought maybe if you both understood how serious this is, you'd reconsider." Aunt Susan didn't say anything, just crossed her arms and waited, her expression unreadable. Maddie took that as her cue to start her pitch. She opened the folder and began pulling out papers, holding them up like they were some kind of holy evidence. "Jason has been dealing with this for years," she began, her voice a perfect blend of concern and authority. "But now it's gotten to the point where he can't function without this surgery. The doctors say it's critical." She went on for a while, detailing how expensive the procedure was and how their terrible insurance wouldn't cover nearly enough of the cost. "We've already put all of our savings into this," she said, her voice trembling with what I'm sure was practiced emotion. "But it's not enough. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for help. Just a small portion of the inheritance. It's just sitting there, unused, and Jason doesn't have time to wait." Aunt Susan didn't budge an inch. "Maddie, I understand that this is hard for you," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But your father left that money for Ethan. It's for his future. It's not up for discussion." Maddie's face changed instantly. The fake sadness and desperation disappeared, replaced by pure, unfiltered anger. "You're unbelievable," she snapped. "How can you stand there and act like this is about Dad's wishes? You've always hated me. You're just using this as an excuse to punish me." "That's enough," Aunt Susan said, her voice turning icy. "You can leave now." Maddie didn't argue. She stuffed her papers back into the folder, shot a death glare at the front door, and stormed off the porch, slamming the gate behind her. But I knew this wasn't over. It was never over with Maddie. A few days later, she tried a different approach. She started texting me directly, completely bypassing Aunt Susan. At first, it was more of the same guilt-tripping. "I can't believe you're letting Aunt Susan control your decisions like this," one message read. "You're 17 years old. You're old enough to think for yourself." When that didn't work, she switched tactics. "You know, Jason has always supported you, right?" she wrote another time. "He was the one who said you could totally get into med school. He believes in you. I can't believe you're turning your back on him now." That one made me laugh out loud. Jason, the same guy who mocked me relentlessly for wanting to be a doctor, suddenly believed in me? Yeah, right. I didn't bother responding to any of her messages, but Maddie didn't stop. They just kept coming, each one more desperate and manipulative than the last. Then came the photo. It was a picture of Jason lying in a hospital bed, looking pale and weak, hooked up to an IV drip and a heart monitor. Maddie had captioned it, "This is what you're ignoring. This is what you're letting happen." I showed it to Aunt Susan, who just shook her head slowly. "She's trying to manipulate you," she said, her voice grim. "Don't fall for it for a second." When the texts didn't work, Maddie escalated. One evening, Aunt Susan got a phone call from someone she hadn't spoken to in years, our cousin Lauren. Apparently, Maddie had reached out to Lauren and spun some sob story about how Aunt Susan was hoarding my inheritance and refusing to help a dying man out of pure spite. Lauren, bless her heart, had called to get Aunt Susan's side of the story. And when Aunt Susan explained what was really happening, Lauren was furious on our behalf. But it showed me how low Maddie was willing to stoop. She wasn't just trying to pressure me, she was trying to turn our entire family against Aunt Susan, painting her as some kind of cruel villain. Over the next week, Maddie reached out to other family members, our great aunt, a second cousin, trying to rally them against Aunt Susan. She framed it like Aunt Susan was some kind of monster, keeping me under her thumb and refusing to help Jason out of sheer pettiness. Most people who knew Aunt Susan saw right through it, but a few, who didn't know the whole story, bought into it, calling Aunt Susan to express their concern. I couldn't believe how far Maddie was willing to go. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about winning. She wanted to break Aunt Susan, to make her cave and give in, just so Maddie could feel like she was in control. The breaking point came when Maddie showed up at Aunt Susan's house with a lawyer in tow. She didn't warn us, didn't call ahead. She just showed up one evening, ringing the doorbell with an air of smug finality. Aunt Susan answered the door, but refused to let Maddie inside. "What do you want now?" she asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. Maddie gestured to the stern-looking man in a suit standing beside her. "I'm filing a legal petition," she said, her tone dripping with self-satisfaction. "You've been manipulating Ethan and mishandling the inheritance. I'm asking the court to remove you as custodian and appoint me instead." Aunt Susan didn't even blink. "Good luck with that," she said, and slammed the door in Maddie's face. After that, it was official. Maddie wasn't just trying to guilt me into giving her the money, she was trying to take it by force. The court date was set, and Aunt Susan and I started preparing with our lawyer, Mr. Carter. Maddie thought she had the upper hand, but she didn't realize how much evidence we had against her. She'd picked the wrong fight, and she was about to find out the hard way. When the court date was finally set, it felt like the calm before a storm. The days leading up to it were thick with a strange, quiet tension. Maddie's legal petition was a work of pure fiction. It accused Aunt Susan of manipulating me, of emotionally abusing me, of mishandling the inheritance, and of trying to control my life for her own selfish benefit. It was all complete and utter nonsense, but Maddie was banking on being able to spin her story well enough, to cry on cue convincingly enough, to make the court believe her version of reality. If she succeeded, the court would appoint her as my legal guardian, giving her full control of my inheritance until I turned 18. She wasn't just asking for a small portion of the money to help with Jason's bills anymore, she wanted all of it. Aunt Susan wasn't rattled. She'd been through enough of Maddie's games and tantrums over the years to know how to stay calm under pressure. We worked closely with Mr. Carter, our lawyer, gathering every piece of evidence we could find to show the court the truth about Maddie's motives. The day of the hearing, Maddie arrived at the courthouse with her lawyer and, of course, Jason in tow. He looked completely out of place, sitting in the back of the courtroom with a perpetual scowl on his face, like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Maddie, on the other hand, was in her element. She walked into the courtroom like she was the hero of some dramatic legal thriller, all fake confidence and exaggerated concern. She even wore a modest, conservative dress, probably in an attempt to look responsible and trustworthy. Her lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, started by painting her as the caring, concerned older sister, someone who only wanted what was best for her poor, misguided younger brother. "My client's sole intention is to protect her brother," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "She is deeply concerned about the undue influence Miss Susan has over him, and believes that the inheritance is not being managed in his best interest." I could feel my blood starting to boil as I listened to him. Maddie hadn't cared about me or about Dad for years. She'd barely shown up to his deathbed and skipped his funeral entirely. And now she was standing there pretending to be my savior. Aunt Susan must have noticed my clenched fists under the table because she gave me a small, reassuring nudge with her elbow, silently telling me to stay calm and let our lawyer do his job. When it was our turn, Mr. Carter dismantled Maddie's argument piece by piece with the calm precision of a surgeon. He started with the basics, the bank records. He presented them to the judge, showing clearly that Aunt Susan hadn't touched a single cent of my inheritance. The funds were being held in a secure custodial account, exactly as outlined in the will, accruing a small amount of interest.
"There is no evidence whatsoever of mismanagement or improper influence," Mr. Carter stated firmly. Then came the part that completely flipped the narrative, the moment I had been waiting for: Maddie's financial records. Mr. Carter had filed a subpoena for them as part of the discovery process, and the results were exactly what we expected, and even worse than we could have imagined. In a matter of just 6 months, Maddie had blown through her entire half of the inheritance. Mr. Carter projected the records onto a screen for the whole courtroom to see. There were charges for a brand new, fully loaded SUV. There were thousands of dollars spent on high-end kitchen appliances they'd never use. There were charges for luxury vacations to resorts in Mexico and Hawaii. There were countless other unnecessary expenses: designer clothes, expensive dinners, electronics. It painted a crystal-clear picture of someone who was financially irresponsible and completely out of her depth, and who was now desperate to get her hands on more money to fix her own mistakes. Finally, Mr. Carter presented the text messages and voicemails Maddie had sent me over the past few weeks. The courtroom was silent as her voice echoed through the room, a recording of her pleading, demanding, and even threatening me. "You're sitting on all this money while my husband is dying," one voicemail said, her voice shrill and accusatory. "If you don't help us, you're going to regret this. I promise you that." The judge's expression hardened as the evidence piled up, each piece a nail in the coffin of Maddie's case. Maddie squirmed in her seat, her confident facade slipping with every passing minute. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. This was my chance to tell the truth, my truth, and I wasn't going to waste it. "Your Honor," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, "this case isn't about protecting me or my inheritance. It's about my sister refusing to take responsibility for her own choices."
Maddie received the exact same inheritance I did, half of everything my dad worked his whole life to leave for us. She spent her share on luxury items and extravagant vacations, and now she's trying to take what's left of mine to fix her mistakes. I glanced over at Maddie, who was glaring at me with a mixture of pure hatred and disbelief, but I didn't stop. Over the past few weeks, Maddie has harassed me with countless messages, tried to guilt me into giving her money, and even involved other family members in an attempt to pressure me. She's not here to protect me. She's here because she wants control. My aunt, on the other hand, has done nothing but support me. She's been there for me every step of the way, making sure I stay on track for med school and honoring my dad's wishes. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't even be here today. I sat back down, my hands shaking slightly, but I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I'd said everything I needed to say, and there was no taking it back. When Maddie got her chance to respond, she doubled down on her sob story, turning on the waterworks for all she was worth. "I've always cared about my brother," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just want what's best for him. Jason's surgery is life or death, and I thought this family could come together to help. I didn't expect this kind of hostility." It was so fake, so transparent, it made my skin crawl. Maddie had spent years treating Aunt Susan like an enemy, and now she was trying to frame herself as the victim. But the evidence was stacked against her, and it was clear the judge wasn't buying her performance for a second. After reviewing everything, the judge delivered the verdict. The evidence clearly shows that Miss Susan has acted responsibly and in the best interest of the respondent in her role as custodian of the inheritance, the judge stated, his voice firm and final. Furthermore, the petitioner's financial history and personal communications reveal a motive that is self-serving rather than protective of the respondent's interests. The petition is dismissed. Maddie's face turned a bright, blotchy red. Her jaw clenched so tightly I thought she might break a tooth. But the judge wasn't done. This court will also investigate whether the petitioner's claims and submitted evidence constitute perjury or fraud. If found guilty, there will be consequences. And, after a brief review, she was. The judge found her guilty of filing false claims and attempting to commit fraud. And the consequences hit her hard. They fined her for wasting court resources, ordered her to attend mandatory counseling to deal with her manipulative behavior, and, most satisfyingly, slapped her with a temporary restraining order to keep her and my aunt. I could barely contain my wave of relief. Aunt Susan gave my shoulder a small, proud squeeze, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt like a massive weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted off my shoulders. The air seemed clearer, the sun seemed brighter.
Aunt Susan and I had stood our ground against Maddie's onslaught, and her schemes had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. She had thought she could manipulate me, bully Aunt Susan, and lie to a court of law to get what she wanted. But in the end, all she had done was expose herself for who she really was, a greedy, selfish, and deeply insecure person who was willing to destroy her own family to feed her sense of entitlement. And now, thanks to the judge's ruling, she couldn't touch me or my future. As we made our way through the courthouse lobby, Maddie tried to catch up to us, her face a mask of fury and desperation. "Ethan, wait!" she called out, her voice cracking. But Aunt Susan stopped, turned to face her, and shut her down with a single icy look. "We're done here, Maddie," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument.
"The court has spoken. Stay away from us." Maddie stopped dead in her tracks, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish out of water, but she didn't say anything. She knew she'd lost. Jason, who had been trailing behind her looking like a scolded puppy, stayed silent the whole time, probably realizing there was no way he could talk his way out of this mess. The two of them left together, Maddie muttering angrily under her breath, but I didn't care what she had to say anymore. The fight was over, and we had won. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new kind of normal. It was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a long time, there were no angry text messages, no unannounced visits, no drama. The restraining order ensured that Maddie couldn't contact us, and her silence was golden. I threw myself into my schoolwork, my grades improving as the stress and anxiety lifted. I started researching colleges with pre-med programs, excitedly planning for the future that Dad had so desperately wanted for me. Aunt Susan was my rock through it all, helping me with applications, celebrating every small victory, and reminding me every day how proud Dad would be. Maddie's life, on the other hand, seemed to be unraveling, a direct consequence of her own actions. Through the family grapevine, I heard that Jason's life-or-death surgery wasn't quite as critical as she had made it out to be. It was serious, yes, but it was elective, and they had managed to find a way to pay for it without my inheritance. I also heard that their financial situation was dire. With her half of the money gone and the fines from the court adding to their debt, they were forced to sell their expensive SUV and downsize their apartment. It was a stark and, frankly, satisfying example of cause and effect. Her greed hadn't just destroyed her credibility in court, it had destroyed the very lifestyle she was so desperate to protect. The mandatory counseling, as ordered by the judge, was another source of humiliation for her. She hated it, of course. She complained to anyone who would listen that the court had no right to force her into therapy, that she wasn't the one with the problem. But from what I heard, the counselor was making her confront some uncomfortable truths about her behavior, her need for control, and her inability to take responsibility for her own actions. I don't know if it will actually help her in the long run, but for now, it was a consequence she had to face. As my 18th birthday approached, Aunt Susan and I met with Mr. Carter one last time to officially transfer the custodianship of the inheritance to me. He congratulated me on my resilience and told me again how proud my father would be. Sitting in that office, holding the paperwork that signified my future, secure and in my own hands, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for the money, but for Aunt Susan. She had fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. She had protected my father's legacy and ensured that his last wish for me would be honored. She was more than an aunt. She was my guardian, my mentor, my family. Looking back on the whole ordeal, it's almost surreal. My own sister, my flesh and blood, saw her father's death not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. She saw her brother's future not as something to be cherished, but as a resource to be plundered. She tried to use a family crisis to justify her greed, and when that didn't work, she tried to use the legal system to steal from me. But in the end, her greed was her undoing. It blinded her to the truth, made her arrogant, and led her to make a series of increasingly desperate and reckless decisions. In her quest to seize my inheritance, she ended up losing everything: her money, her credibility, and what was left of her relationship with me. She destroyed her own life, and she had no one to blame but herself. Now, as I stand on the threshold of adulthood, ready to start the next chapter of my life, I'm free. I'm free from her drama, free from her manipulation, and free to pursue the dream that my father and I shared. And as I look toward the future, I know that no matter what challenges come my way, I have the strength, the resilience, and the unwavering support of the family that chose me. And that's an inheritance more valuable than any amount of money.